Extreme hinge cutting. That's this episode of Death by Bunjie. Okay, let's be honest here. There's not going to be anything extreme about this video. There's not anything extreme about the hinge cutting that I'm going to talk about in this video. I just wanted to share some of my thoughts on the concept of hinge cutting, timber management, cutting trees, browse for deer, browse for wildlife in this video. There are tons of great videos on hinge cutting on YouTube. I've read a lot of magazine articles and reading a book now by Steve Bartella. All of that information prompted me to make this video because there's a few extra things that I thought maybe I'd share with you, some little tips that I've picked up and things that I would like to do as far as this place is concerned, and I thought maybe you would find that interesting. So there's not going to be anything groundbreaking or earth-shattering about this video, but it will hopefully be something fun for you to watch. What is hinge cutting? That's a great place to start for this video. Hinge cutting is a specific way of cutting down a tree so that the tree remains in contact with its trunk so that nutrients and sap can still flow up that tree and down that tree somewhat, even though it's a lot more limited, but they can still keep that tree alive. Hinge cutting is intended to provide the chance for that tree to continue to live. That's all hinge cutting is. Hinge cutting is just an alternative to other methods of cutting down a tree, whether it's a plunge cut or a wedge cut or what have you, the more traditional wedge cut. You know, every time I cut firewood, we use a wedge cut. You take a wedge out of one side of the tree, cut through the other side of the tree falls over. That is wedge cutting. Now, hinge cutting, you're only cutting one side of the tree, cutting through from one direction, only about halfway, tip that tree over, and the remaining wood serves as a hinge to allow that tree to sort of just lay there instead of falling over on the ground. The advantage of hinge cutting is just that it allows that tree to live potentially for the next year or maybe several years and continue to produce browse for deer. That's really what hinge cutting is all about. Hinge cutting, if you're just cutting a tree down just to take it out of there, you would not use hinge cutting. Instead, you would use a more traditional wedge cut. That's the way to take that tree out. So just keep that in mind. When we're talking about knocking over trees for deer, sometimes we're talking about hinge cutting. Other times we're talking about wedge cutting. It's just a method of cutting down a tree. There are basically three reasons, I think, why you might want to consider going out on a nice, beautiful pre-spring day, late winter day like this, and start cutting some trees, hinge cutting or otherwise, to help out some deer. And there are basically three reasons why you might want to consider doing that: food, funnels, and bedding areas. Keep in mind that no matter how good a job we do on those food plots, deer still like to eat about 60% of their diet on woody browse, believe it or not. Deer are browsers. They walk through the woods, they eat, they walk, they eat, they walk, and then they lay down and chew their cud. That's basically their daily routine. They like to have a lot of understory available for that walking, for that browsing. The more of that you have available, the more deer you're going to see. The more of it you have available, the healthier those deer will be going through the winter. Right here along this little deer trail that I'm standing on, Genevieve and I came through here yesterday. We went through and we did a lot of cutting just by hand, broke some of the trees over by hand, pulled them over by hand, and sort of tucked them under other trees just to get them bent down because the deer can only reach 5 feet or so off the ground. By tipping them down here, I can already see the deer have gone through and eaten a lot of the ends off of this little maple here that I've tipped over. Not only does this provide some food for the deer today and going on for this week and whatnot, but later on, this also provides food for deer because it creates more light getting down through the canopy. Eventually, that will result in more undergrowth, more young trees growing up, forbs, stuff like that that the deer can eat, and it will thicken this place up and provide more food. Another reason why you might want to hinge cut some trees is to create funnels. Now, like I said, I'm standing along this deer trail that runs back and forth here. It runs toward my ridge staging food plot, which my hope has always been to get deer to go to that little food plot earlier in the day before they would go out in the open field to the larger destination food plot. I'm a little bit hopeful because I see this deer trail going across directly to that food plot. To make sure that deer are encouraged to keep using that trail, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and hinge cut more of these trees, these small saplings, so that deer continue to use this trail to head over to that food plot. That will discourage them a little bit from heading out that way, discourage them from wandering over there, and instead sort of keep them headed in the right direction toward that food plot. I can always use that as a technique to set a tree stand at a nearby tree over the trail so I can shoot down into it. That might be a good technique depending on where you're at. The third reason you might want to do some cutting this time of year is to create bedding areas. If you take these trees out now, whether it's hinge cutting or wedge cutting, whatever you choose to do, take the tree out completely or leave it hinge cut. Either way, you can use that to your advantage and to the advantage of the deer by creating some bedding areas. Over in here behind me, the neighbors have a lot of thick bedding areas, but I'd like to encourage some of the deer to bed here, to create more bedding areas here. So I've, over the last couple of years, been working on thickening this region up around me here, up in there and then back around over in there. And I've done that by hinge cutting, by tipping over some of the trees and by taking out other trees. Typically what I do is I hinge cut, drop the tree. If it's living the next year, I let it go. If it's not, then I go through and block it up for firewood. You can create bedding areas that you want for your property. If you want a lot of doe bedding areas for doe families, you're going to want to create a larger bedding area. And for bucks, you're going to want to create a smaller bedding area because they typically are going to bed all by themselves. They're going to hang out solo and all that stuff. Or there might be a small bachelor group depending on the time of year. But those bedding areas need to have escape routes. Basically, all a bedding area is going to be is some sort of a sprocket design, what I call a sprocket design. You would want to hinge cut or tip your trees away from the center of that bedding area and then clear out the bedding area so that they can sit in there nice and comfortable. For bedding areas, you're going to want to pick a pretty flat site or maybe a slight incline, but deer don't like to bed on side hills or anything like that. They need to have a little bit of visibility so they can see predators coming, and they need to have an escape route in the event that predators head their way. Now, when do you want to do that? I'm here in late February. It's a great time for me because the trapping season is over with, the hunting seasons are over with, and we're a couple of months away from the fawns dropping. We're a couple of months away from spring gobbler. So I've got a lot of free time right now, at least for woods stuff, or to be out here in the woods doing stuff. And this is a great time to be out here doing this kind of an activity. I love it. Genevieve enjoys coming out here and we have a good time, getting a little bit of exercise and hanging out in the woods. It's also a time when I'm cutting up the last of our firewood to make sure that I have firewood to get it through the rest of the winter. So it works out. This is just a great time to do it. It may not be the best time of year for the trees standpoint, though, to do it. And I say that for two reasons. Number one, this is the time of year when the temperatures are obviously very cold or very low. And for that reason, the trees freeze. They aren't as pliable, they don't bend as well. And when you hinge cut one of these trees, they tip over, they tend to snap. Some trees are going to be more prone to that than others, and your temperature is going to affect that too. But that's something to consider. For that reason, you may want to consider doing your hinge cutting in July or early August when the trees actually go semi-dormant. Believe it or not, summertime, trees tend to go a little bit dormant in the summer, and that's they don't lose their leaves or anything like that. But they slow down a little bit, and then with the temperatures higher like that, these trees are a lot more pliable. Not a bad time to do it. Plus, either one of those times is good because the fawns are going to be in there in May and June and July, and you won't be disturbing that young wildlife so much in July and August or in February. So these are the good times of years to do it. But one good reason to do this in February is for food. This is a time of year when there's a little bit of snow cover, the deer can't access food. There isn't any really good high quality food out there unless you still got turnips, for me anyway. In my experience, they'll eat right up to about the size of a pencil, maybe a little bit bigger, that big around. I mean, they'll eat it over before April. These will be cleaned up pretty good. Be careful before you start cutting trees. You do not want to go into the woods and just start cutting trees over. You can do more harm than good. It takes a long time for these trees to grow, and unless you know exactly what species you're cutting, you may not want to cut that tree. Some species are beneficial to deer. You would not want to cut oaks, for example. I mean, if they're dropping food at all, I don't care about the location, I don't care about anything. Any oak tree, if there were oak trees on here, I would not be cutting them. The closest thing I have to a really good mast producing tree on this property is probably beech. Some of the beech trees drop beech nuts, which the deer can eat. It's easy to confuse beech with maple when it doesn't have any leaves, so you got to be careful about that. What I try to do is go through and mark the trees the summer before I cut them when I can see the leaves and tell exactly what species it is. But you want to be real careful about that. You don't want to go through and start cutting trees that have a value other than hinge cutting to wildlife. Maple's a pretty low value timber for deer anyway. So I cut those. I don't mind cutting those over and leaving there, but they're great for the browse. The deer love to eat the browse off maples, so it serves that purpose. I had shared with you guys the fact that I'm reading a book from Steve Bartella. I shared that on our Facebook page. That's a really good book if you're into the deer management, into the land management portion of deer hunting. If you're into that stuff, look into his book. But one of the things he points out is you have to have a plan for everything you're doing. You want to have a plan, though, based on how you are going to hunt the property. You want to think about how you're going to access your stands midday, morning, or evening, how you're going to come in and out without bumping deer. And every property is going to be different, but you have to sort of look at that and have that plan in mind before you start cutting trees. In fact, I wouldn't cut a tree until you have that plan in mind. You don't want to make it harder for deer to access your food sources. If you just go through and hinge cut all over the place, you might discourage deer from even going to your food source. They might just turn around and go somewhere else because it's easier. They're going to follow a different path. So hinge cutting, you got to keep in mind the direction you want the deer to travel, whether it's to or from your food plots, and keep that in mind. And additionally, to keep in mind what Steve Bartella is talking about, you don't want them to be heading out to the food plot and then run into you because you encourage their movement across your path. Be mindful of that. How are you going to get to and from your stand, and how do you want the deer to go to and from their food sources? That's one thing you're going to want to definitely take into account before you start cutting trees. Obviously, safety is important. Make sure you're wearing glasses, make sure you're covering your ears, wear some gloves to make sure you got a good grip on that chainsaw, and wear some steel-toed shoes if you think that's appropriate. Have a spotter, have somebody stand next to you so they can tell you if the tree starts to break or starts to go, and they can sort of facilitate the whole process, and they can run and get help if you get hurt, that kind of thing. Keep safety in mind when you're doing this stuff. Now, there are a million other topics when it comes to this stuff. I am only scratching the surface, and that's why I'm telling you this is not exactly, there's nothing extreme about what I'm talking about here. Just getting started on this process, just getting started with the hinge cutting for this season. I'm going to continue to do this, and I'll update you on our Facebook page as to how that process is going along. There are future videos coming next year probably on this same topic. As it's this time of year is a good time of year to be doing this stuff, I will be putting out videos talking about it. So please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Check out our Facebook page for regular updates there. And until next time, all hail Bunjie!
The second state is number one in my book.